Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Greene. I am the president and CEO of the National Association of Investment Companies. NAIC is a 50-year-old trade association of diverse-owned private equity firms and hedge funds. I am delighted to be joining you today. This is NAIC's first in our Insight series. Today will be a Trustee Insight. My guest is Henry Jones. And Henry is president of the CalPERS Board of Administration. He's someone that's well known to the industry, and he's someone that I consider a friend. Please join me in welcoming Henry Jones to the live stream. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you, Bob.
Excellent. Well, Henry, you and I have known each other more than 10, probably even 15 years. And one of the things that has always been I've always appreciated is just how willing you are to help people understand what CalPERS is and how to get access to CalPERS. And you've certainly been a friend to the industry and also to the NAIC. So when the staff asked me who I wanted to open the series up, I said, if we can get Henry Jones, I'd be delighted. And I'm so glad you accepted our invitation.
Thank you, Bob. It's my pleasure to participate in this dialogue. As you mentioned, one of your first events dealing with dialogues with the trustee. So I welcome this opportunity to have this dialogue with you and look forward to our discussion.
Excellent, excellent. So for the folks, for our audience, I'll just give you a little overview. Henry, I'm going to ask Henry some questions. We're going to try to structure this as more of a conversation. We're going to start out with a little background on Henry, get some insights on CalPERS, and then we'll move into some of the pertinent questions of the day relating to CalPERS' strategy and how the COVID virus has impacted CalPERS, and end up with maybe some suggestions and insights on how to access CalPERS. So let me, without further ado, let me start off. Henry, tell us a little bit about you, where you come from, what you did professionally, anything that you're willing to share to help us understand more about Henry Jones.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob. You got a whole day? Yeah, no, actually, I was born in Galveston, Texas, and you may know that that's where the Juneteenth originated. So that's a little bit about Galveston, Texas, is that where the slaves were not apprised of the emancipation until almost 2 years later after Lincoln had signed it. So Galveston is well known for that, and that's where we have this Juneteenth. But anyway, I graduated from high school there, and I had played basketball on the team there, and my goal was to try to get a scholarship to go to college, because my parents couldn't afford to send me. So, but finally, when I graduated, the colleges said, "I'm sorry, you're too short." So then my parents couldn't afford to send me to college. And then they only offered like 3 academic scholarships. So I wasn't in the top 3. So then I decided, well, what am I going to do? And so actually 6 other high school graduates and myself, we got in 2 cars and we drove to California looking for a better way of life. And so, you know, the other 6 guys that wasn't willing to take any kind of job, but I decided I was going to take any kind of job. So I got a job washing dishes in a bowling alley to have means to survive. And so then I heard that there was an opening for examination for custodians at the Los Angeles Unified School District. So went, took the test, and got the job as a custodian. So I was assigned to high school in Southgate. And it was a segregated high school by that time. Okay. Matter of fact, workmen that would come to campus would come up to me because I was high school, right out of high school. And so we didn't know they had desegregated this school. I say they haven't. I'm a worker, not a student. So anyway, and so I'd have lunch with these 2 elderly custodians, 2 ladies, every night. And they would just say, well, young man, you seem to have so much on the ball. Why aren't you in school? You know, I say, oh, I'm going to go one of these days. And they just pounded on me almost every night when we would have lunch. You need to go to school. You need to go to school. And so it got to a point where I see them coming, I go the other way because I know what they're going to
want to talk about.
Yeah, right. And so anyway, I went on and enrolled in college. And so as I continued my education, I noticed that early on there was a correlation between promotions and education. So I said, "Oh, this works," and so I continued to pursue, my educational goals while I was promoting. And I promoted to be a supervisor of an elementary school, then a supervisor of custodians in a junior high school, then a high school, and ultimately I became an area operations director that was over like 50 schools for their maintenance and operation, cleaning and plumbing, gardening, etc. And so by that time, I had earned my degree in finance. And so the director of operations called one day and said, "Hey, I understand, Jones, you have a degree in finance." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, would you like to come on a special assignment down to the central headquarters and work on the operations budget?" And I said, "I welcome that opportunity." So that's how I got into the finance side. After that, I promoted several more times into what they referred to as an administrative service officer, overseeing the budgets of 1/4 of the district schools. And then I became a deputy budget director, then budget director, and then chief financial officer. So after 37 years, when I retired, I look back and I say I went from the broom room to the boardroom. And
Wow.
it's quite a journey. And so then I worked as a CFO for the last 4 years of my career with the district. And at that time, it was PricewaterhouseCoopers. You know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
They were interested in expanding their business to the West Coast for state and local government. So I knew one of the partners, and they would call and ask me to give them my views on California finance a couple times a year. And each time we would finish that conversation, they would say, "Well, why don't you come work for us?" And I would say, "No, I'm happy where I am, so I'll continue to work." And so one of those days, when something goes wrong, everything goes wrong. It was one of those days, and they asked me about that question again, and so I said, "Make me an offer." So that's how I ended up working for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And you may recall that all of the major accounting firms had to divest themselves from their assurance services, from their consulting services. And so I was in the consulting services, and so we were sold off to IBM. And I continued that role as a business development executive for IBM. And then I subsequently retired from there and tried to learn how to play a little golf.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the career. And then also while I was at LA Unified School District, I also worked on evenings sometime as an adjunct professor teaching school finance.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful career. And it's a little bit odd to be talking about it as if it's over, because you're here, in a completely different career, working for CalPERS, still serving, still leading, still involved. So my compliments and hats off to you for a dynamic career and a continuation of that. So Henry, tell us a little bit about CalPERS. So, CalPERS is one of those organizations that, depending upon, it's super relevant to most everything. It's a ubiquitous organization, but it comes up in the news. Sometimes it comes up in the news on, about employee issues. Sometimes it comes up on a global investment issue. Sometimes it comes up about water and air, and it's a fascinating organization. But tell us a little bit about what CalPERS really is at its core, and then some of the things that people may not realize that CalPERS does to help its beneficiaries.
Okay, well, thank you for that question, Bob. Yeah, CalPERS is organization. Actually, it was established in, I guess, 1932 to provide retirement benefit for state workers. And subsequent to that, after a few years, they expanded that coverage to school district non-teaching personnel, and also to cities and counties throughout the state. And CalPERS, the composition, it provides benefits for about 2 million members. And those members are from the state workforce, including the California State University system. It includes the members from local school districts throughout the state. As I mentioned, the non-teaching personnel, because the teachers are part of CalPERS. And then it provides benefits to cities and counties and special districts. And these are, there are few large school counties and cities that have their own retirement systems, such as Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City. But most of the other smaller cities and counties throughout the state are part of CalPERS. And the composition of the board is that the 13-member board are made up by 6 members that are actually elected to the board. And those categories of election is, one is for all retirees in the system, whether you retired from the state or from a school district or a county. We have about 600,000 retirees in the system, and they have the ability to elect one of the members to the board. And I'm that member elected by the retirees. And then we have one is elected by all city and county employees. One is elected by all school district non-teaching personnel. One is elected by all state active employees. And then there are 2 what we call at large, which means that everyone in the system can elect those 2 board members. So that's the 6 that are elected. Then we have 3 appointed board members, 2 of which are appointed by the governor. And the governor's appointees, one must be in the insurance industry somewhere, and one must have, and by the way, these are all in the state constitution. So the legislature just can't change the structure. If you wanted to make a change in the structure, you would have to go back to the voters of the state of California. But one must be appointed by the governor that's in the insurance industry, and one must be an elected official somewhere in the state. You may recall when Willie Brown was the mayor of San Francisco, he was appointed to the CalPERS board because he was an elected official. And so there we have what we call 4, one of the other appointees is by the legislature. They have 1 seat jointly by the Senate and the Assembly. They alternate in appointing one of those members to the board. And then there are 4 what we call ex officio members, and that's the state treasurer, the state controller, 1 from the state personnel board, and 1 from Cal HR, which is the human resources department. So that makes up the 13-member board. And our assets at the end of June this past fiscal year was $389 billion. And some people don't realize that we also provide healthcare coverage to 1.5 million members. And matter of fact, CalPERS is the 2nd largest healthcare purchaser in the United States behind the federal government. So that kind of gives you an overview of the makeup of the CalPERS board. And our mission is to continue to be able to provide benefits for our members for their entire lives. So that's our overall mission, is to make sure the funds are there so that we can pay out that $24 billion a year currently to our members that have retired.
Thank you for that, Henry. You know, I've had some experience in working with a pension board myself, and separate and apart from what I learned about the pension system and the duties and the responsibilities, I basically realized that all of the managers in the marketplace really don't spend a lot of time thinking about what the real mission is. Right? Sometimes we tend to approach it thinking that your mission is to allocate money to us, right? But really, that's a side mission. That's an ancillary mission, because the reason for all of it is obviously to pay the benefits. And you just hit upon something that's very key. You're basically spending about 7 to 8% of your assets every year. It goes out the door in terms of benefits, plus the other costs of running a plan. So, you know, I'm guilty, Henry, of thinking that CalPERS has all the money in the world. You know that. I'm guilty of that. And it puts a lot in perspective when you think about how much CalPERS spends per year and how much, you know, it takes to operate the system. So, you know, kudos to you and your team for that awesome responsibility. So now, Henry, I really want to touch on one thing before we get into the meat of it. tell us how you got involved with CalPERS and how long you've been involved and the various roles and responsibilities you've had there.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. Again, when I retired from PricewaterhouseCoopers / IBM in 2005, I think it was. And I was, as I mentioned, I was trying to learn how to play golf. And so I got this call in 2007 from a couple of people that were members of CalPERS, retirees. And they said, "Hey, Jones, there's a seat opening up on the CalPERS board that's for the retiree seat. So why don't you run?" I said, "Nah, I'm done, man. I've worked all my life and I'm done. And so they said, "Well, man, no, you'd be a good fit. We thank you. I said, "No, I don't want to get into politics and run for anything. I'm done." And so then it seemed like it was unearthed. All of a sudden, I started getting all these calls and said, "We heard that you are not interested, but we'll support you." And so finally, I said, "Okay, what do I need to do?" And they said, "Well, you need to campaign." So I say, "Okay." So, and by the way, I got my daughter to be my campaign manager.
Okay.
And she asked me 2 questions. She said, "Well, Dad, why you want to do this?"
Right.
And her second question, "How much you gonna pay me?" So she ran my campaign, and so I was actually successful in 2008, and was elected to the board as the retiree representative. And that was a 4-year terms. By all the elected officials are elected for 4-year terms.
Yep.
And so my second and third 4-year term, I didn't have a challenger, so I was automatically reseated by the Secretary of State,
Okay.
certifying that there was no challenges. And so then this past year, I actually had a challenge and I ran a campaign again, and I was successful in being elected to my 4th term. So I'm in the first year of my 4th term right now on the board. And during the course of those years, I've served as the chair of the Finance Committee. I've served as the chair of the Investment Committee, and I am currently the president of the board. Matter of fact, I'm in my 2nd year. And so each year, the 13 board members elect who their president is going to be. Mm-hmm. And then the board president assign members to various committees.
Okay.
And those committee members elect their own chairs of the various committees. So I'm in my 2nd year as president of the board.
That's outstanding. It's no secret that you've chosen some very powerful, important committees. I understand from my work on pension plans that there's compensation and there's administration and benefits and actuarial, but you've focused on finance and investment, which is no surprise because that's your background. Getting into one of our early questions, Henry, with COVID, with political season upon us, with all the myriad challenges that we face in 2020. What specifically about the pension plan and CalPERS in general? What keeps you up at night? What's on your mind as you think about the overall health, security, and operations of the CalPERS plan?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I like to just extend my condolences to the 140,000 citizens who have lost their lives due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's just so such a heartfelt loss that many of the families are having to go through. And the thing that I wake up every morning is concerned about how many more lives have we lost, mm-hmm. whether it's related to the COVID-19, because as I mentioned, it seems to be accelerating at a rapid pace at these days. And then the second, how many lives have we lost due to at the hands of the police throughout our country, and whether it's dealing with the racism, sexism, classism, whatever the case may be, but we're losing lives related to that kind of actions. And then the other thing I wake up worrying about is the homelessness in this country. And I traveled throughout the Los Angeles area, and it seems though that every time I go down a street that I've been going down for a long time, and I'm beginning to see more and more homeless people, and it's evident that it is, but they're just all over the place. And so we we got to do something about that. And then the other thing that worries me when I wake up is continued disparity between people of color and women in income. You look at the income, whether it's private sector, public sector, et cetera, you will note that, and the data shows this, so I don't have to verify this, but it shows that there's an income disparity when it comes to people of color and women, and that's another. And the other thing that this pandemic has unveiled is the disparity in health coverage care that is also uppermost on my mind. So that's kind of what I wake up, but the biggest thing that worried me about CalPERS now is that this health crisis has turned into an economic crisis. And and it's all over the world, and it has severely affected all of the investors all over the world. And the big question is, how long will it last? And I don't think anyone knows. And so while we are developing strategies to deal with the economics of this pandemic, we still will not be able to get past this until there's a solution from a healthcare perspective. So it's another uncertainty that's out there. Whereas when you look at the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, it was all economics and finance, and that you were dealing with strategies that will overcome that. But this one, even though you may be developing strategies from an economic point of view, it may not be solving the problem because we got this healthcare issue that has to be addressed. So that's kind of like the things that I were, and I mentioned to you, we have paid up $24 billion a year in benefits. And so, you know, you look at the impact that this is going to have on investments, and it's troubling when you look at it. And the other thing about that is that when you look at where the money is coming from, that $24 billion to pay those ongoing benefits is coming from three sources. One is from investment returns.
Yep.
One is from the employee contribution, and the other is from the employer contribution.
Yep.
And when investment returns don't hit their bogey or make that market, we have to go back to the cities and the counties and the school districts to increase contribution, because those payments have to be made. Because we can't control the amount the employee pay, because that's a legislative issue.
Yeah.
So we have this delicate balance of trying to get the returns, and if we don't, we got to then raise the contribution. And then you talk about the public discourse, and then all of a sudden a school or a city or a county say CalPERS is causing me to go bankrupt. Right. Because we, you know, even though it may be a small portion of the overall budget, but that's what you made reference to, the public discourse and the coverage that we get in the news media, because many things are saying because of CalPERS.
Yeah. And so, Henry, let's talk a little bit about, so you talked about the money comes from three places: returns, employee contribution, or employer contribution. Let's talk a little bit about that return bucket. What is your actuarial rate of return? And tell folks what that means. And how does CalPERS think about its actuarial rate of returns in this climate and in this investment environment?
Okay, good. Okay, yeah, thank you. The rate of return is 7%, which means that we need to earn 7% on our investments in order to stabilize and pay that $24 billion a year, and without having to go and increase the rates of the employers, like the cities and counties and school districts. So that's the 7% that we need to earn in order to make those annual payments. And so when that rate of return goes below that 7%, where are you going to make up the money?
Right.
And we can't raise the rates on the employees, so then that's when we have to go to increase the rates on the cities and the county, or our agencies, if you will. So we have that is a policy that we made. And matter of fact, several years ago, that rate of return was as high as 8.5%. And back in the early 2000s, and you saw that going forward, the long-term growth expectations was not going to deliver 8.5.
Right.
So that's when the board started to look at, well, we need to modify that rate of return and reduce it to a more reasonable level. And even now, it's a challenge, even at 7%. But if we just arbitrarily reduce it without taking some kind of other action, the other side is increase the contributions at the agencies throughout the state. So that's why we have, and another point I like to make on that is that the steps we're taking, as you mentioned, is that during the 2008, 2009 crisis, CalPERS lost over $100 billion. And so one of the backdrops to that is that now what we have to do so that if there's another downturn, market drawdown like we're experiencing now, what are our levers that we could pull to mitigate the impact? And so the whole discussion is not if, it's when these kinds of occurrences happen. So what we did after the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, we looked at, number one, that rate of return, and we began to reduce it. And we had to be very modest in how we reduce it, because if you reduce it too fast, remember I said all of a sudden you have to raise the contribution rates on so we decided to reduce that over time. And so now that's how we got down to the 7%. We also, back in that time, is that we looked at our asset allocation, and we look at our asset allocation every 4 years to talk about, are we allocating our money in the right asset classes to get the returns that we need? And one of the things that we did after the financial crisis, we wanted to take some of the risk off the table, because, you know, risk and reward, you know, how it works, but if you don't earn it, you can't bank it. And so therefore, we were positioned to start to reduce our risk profile. And therefore, we took dollars out of, say, equities and put them in more in fixed income and safer categories. And that's when we created also our liquidity asset class. Because what happened in 2008, 2009, when the market crashed, remember those benefits? Well, I said every month it goes out. And about that, back then, I think it was like $19.5 billion going out. It still had to go out. So how are we going to pay that if we weren't earning the income? So what we had to do is go and sell assets. And so we said, in order to avoid that happening again, we needed to create a liquidity asset class, so that in the event that it happens again, it not only would take care of our cash flow issues, but also would allow us to take advantage of some opportunities generally that do exist during these kind of economic downturns. So those are some of the steps we took. And we also, at the time, we changed our amortization period, which was about a 30-year amortization period, when ups and downs, the impact on the individual agencies. And so we reduced that to 20 years. And so that over time will save the agencies and the state billions of dollars going forward. So that's the other aspect, is that we have to always look at the long-term implications, because we got to pay benefits 30, 40, 50 years from now. And sometimes people look at what action we take today and they say, well, why are they doing that? But we're thinking long-term. And so we're taking action to make sure that the fund is sustainable for the long haul. And that's why we do take a look at that asset allocation on every 4-year basis, and to see whether or not our capital market assumptions need to change, because in a downturn market, you have to make those kind of adjustments going forward. So those are some of the steps that we take to look at how we're going to, address the continuation of this fund.
No, I thank you for those insights. Again, there's no book you can read this in. There's no TV network that's going to necessarily talk about it. But you and the other trustees, 13 trustees, have an awesome responsibility, right? The things that you have to consider. I want to reflect a little bit. One of the things that when I was a trustee, we spent a lot of time dealing with was moving from a defined benefit pension plan to a defined contribution plan. And, it's obvious why you'd want to do that, because you want to shift, the risk and the responsibility from the state and shift it over to the individual. Um, where is CalPERS in that discussion? Do you guys have you pushed forward with your DC plan? And how will that affect people like you and my parents and folks that the deal was give me time, give me 30 years, and I'll give you a set amount for life. Now they have to deal with responsibilities around their own internal rate of return and what assets, and just where do you think that debate is going, and how has CalPERS thought about DB versus DC?
Well, I could tell you that the board is solely behind continuation of the defined benefit plan as opposed to the defined contribution. And CalPERS, as you may know, and as you do know, I'm sure, is that we do support retirement income security for all.
Yes.
And so, but what happens is many times you get it because you do have a defined benefit program. Many times the critics of CalPERS may attack us because we do have this benefit, and they don't realize that we should be working to include others in this some kind of retirement security, because there's so many people in this country that don't have any kind of security. You look at data that comes up often. They say that 40% of Americans, if there's a $400 unexpected cost in their household, they would go bankrupt. I mean, that's it's shameful. And so why we don't believe that it's appropriate to change our benefit program, because just like the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, let's assume that you were, and many people were, in defined contribution plans. And just say you were getting ready to retire in 2010, you had to put it on hold because you just lost everything. 50% of your assets were gone, so no longer could you retire. So this is you can't have a long-term strategy of retirement with a defined contribution. That's why we support the defined benefit program approach. Now, we do provide supplemental type of benefits to our members. They could, on a 457 that operates such as a defined contribution, but that's at the discretion of the member as opposed to the plan being that basic retirement system for them. So I fully support the defined benefit plan. Now, that doesn't suggest that we need to look at ways to deal with these ongoing issues just as we're dealing with right now. And so we got to look at, as we go forward, is that a lot of economists are saying that we are going to be in a downturn market for a while.
Yeah.
And so my point earlier that if those returns go down, how do you make them up? So that's the discussion and the debate we got to look at, is that how do we achieve that 7%?
Yep.
Because if you can't achieve it in your basic profile now of your allocation strategies, then you got to look at those allocation strategies and see what can I change so I could be more offensive in achieving that 7%, because you need that 7%. But the way you're doing it now may not get you there. And that's why we're going to be looking at this whole process of better assets, as our CIO Ben Mang saying, and more assets in those categories, so that we could see what strategies we could develop to get to that 7%, because we need that. Otherwise, we got a big problem going backwards.
So, Henry, let's go ahead and dive into the thing that our audience is always focused on, and our membership is focused on. Talk to us a little bit about the Emerging Manager Program, its history, why CalPERS has it, and where it's headed. Where do you think the plan is headed over the course of the next several years?
Well, I think that, number one, as you said, that CalPERS history with the Emerging Manager goes back over 20 plus years, and we were leader in that area. And we, as we look at this 7% target that I'm talking about, this is all Emerging Managers. Part of that discussion also is that we need to be sure that we could find ways to achieve that 7%. And we would be looking to all opportunities to see whether or not it could be achieved. And the goal would be is how can not only the emerging managers, but other managers going to help us achieve that 7%. But the emerging managers are part of that discussion. We did make some changes in the private equity and managers recently because we were looking at the fees that were being charged, and we decided to bring a number of those assets in-house. So now we're actually about 80% of our assets are managed in-house, and we recognize that it did save some fees, and every dollar we save in fees or our operational costs goes into the pot to earn investment returns. So that's what we're looking at over the long term, is to see how we could achieve that 7%, and that would include looking at ways with the emerging managers. So we're not disbanding emerging managers. So I don't want to leave that impression. We will continue to utilize emerging managers, and of course, and that's why our approaches may be slightly different, where we're now more focused on the fund-to-fund approach, where we have the Grosvenors and the Canyons and the Arrowheads, et cetera, that we allocate money to them, and then they go and allocate money to the emerging manager program. Because we found that back in the years where CalPERS used to have a direct involvement on all the emerging managers, like 300 different managers, it wasn't sustainable. So that's one of the reasons we went to the approach of fund-to-fund managers, and that's how we're rolling this out. But and just as for the public who may not know, concerns that were raised by the emerging managers, well, are we getting out emerging managers? And that's why we initiate in response to a request, the meeting with all of these trade associations such as yours and AIM and NASP and some of the others, to talk about how we go forward and improve communications. Because that's part of the problem, is sometimes if you don't know what's going on, then you may interpret it differently. And so we want to make sure that as a result of our recent meeting with your group and others, we're going to improve our communications going forward. But the emerging managers is going to be part of that process. And the other thing that came about as a result of emerging managers, we used to make these allocations because you had to be a certain size. And then when you got so big, you no longer was classified as an emerging manager. And Vista is a good example of that. They had to leave. Now, so why couldn't we keep Vista? Look at it today. It's a household name. Right. And so we now have created this transition process where you can go from an emerging manager to a direct manager in the whole process. So we don't lose those opportunities to continue those types of relationships going forward.
So Henry, I go to a lot of conferences. I speak at a lot of conferences. You go to a lot of conferences. You speak at a lot of conferences. You meet with a lot of folks. You were at the NAIC conference this year, and I'm sure you've been to many of the others. How would you say the average trustee gains his understanding at a sufficient level of the emerging manager space and the investment space in general? And what do you do to keep yourself current on the issues and trends in that regard?
Well, talking to you is one, and continue to talk to the organizations, and most all of those organizations that are involved with emerging managers, AIM, NAS, and your organization, you have these conferences and workshops on a regular, ongoing basis. And I would suggest the trustees participate in those, because that's where you get the frank dialogue that you have between the emerging managers and the allocators of those resources, such as the pension fund. So I think that's a wonderful place to have that dialogue and get these clear understandings. And also what CalPERS has done, and we kind of, because of the pandemic right now, but we have instituted maybe like 6 years ago now, the annual diversity conference with CalPERS, where we would convene all of the diverse managers and anyone else, by the way, who wanted to participate in an annual conference by CalPERS, where we have these dialogues about how do you get access to capital, and what are some of the requirements of getting this access to capital. And so we have long been a part of that type of approach. As a matter of fact, when you may recall several years ago, the state law changed where you had to register as a lobbyist if you were a placement agent. And so it was a concern from the emerging managers that they were going to lose their access to CalPERS. And so what we did in response to that is we created this tool that's called the Investment Proposal Tracking System, where you don't need someone to go speak on your behalf. You can go directly into CalPERS's tool and submit your proposal. And then based on its the tenets of that proposal, it will be formed out to the appropriate asset class to determine whether or not it's something that we're currently involved in or doing, to see whether or not it could be evaluated. And if it is, then many times it's then referred over to one of our fund-to-fund managers. And then that's how they actually get the deep dive into understanding that proposal and that company to determine whether or not an allocation can be made. So it's we continue to do that, and I think it and also I think that participating in workshops, have the trustees participate in the workshops of your organization like we're doing today, and so other trustees could hear some of the comments from their peers and maybe take some of that back and deal with lessons learned. And so, and because lessons learned is for me too. Just because we've been a leader in the emerging management program, but every year, every month seems as though I'm learning something else about, strategies of what we can do to improve relationships, and also finding ways to, without losing sight of earning that 7% though.
Wayne Gretzky talked a lot about his strategy in hockey was to go where the puck was going to be, not where the puck is today. And I've often advised emerging managers to go where the investment strategy and the returns are going to be, as opposed to where they are today. What advice would you give emerging managers that are either trying to work with CalPERS or trying to work with other large pension plans about what they should do to make themselves more valuable to the organization in the future?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, and I think it's important that we have this fund-to-fund managers. And I think before you reach out to them, and because they're the ones that's going to take the deep dive. And especially now with the COVID-19, they're going to be looking at the underlying investment companies in maybe a different way. So you need to find out what that is. And so, because they're the ones that's going to be making that decision about whether or not you're going to be contributing to that 7% return. And they're going to be looking at your whole portfolio, your manager structure, and all of the legal requirements. And so I would suggest that you reach out to them. And by the way, also attend their conferences, because they have conferences that deals with this specific issue as emerging manager process. And matter of fact, most of them in your organization do the same thing. You have these introductions where you have the table talks, and these new managers can be sitting with the allocators and understanding some of the tenets of the various pension funds about what they're looking for. Because, we're not investing in everything. And if you come into us with an investment that's not part of our portfolio, not part of our long-term strategy, we just don't deal with it. And so that's how you get an understanding of what the pension funds are doing. And I think that's a great way to get access, is that go to these conferences that you and NASP and AIM and American Alliance puts on, because that's where the dialogue is occurring. Because you're not going to get the same dialogue at CalPERS board meeting,
You've been on a lot of these calls, and you've seen my hair turn grayer and grayer in these calls as I've gotten older and older. You've been nice enough to pull me to the side and help me understand. What would you say if you could change one thing about this whole dance and relationship between the diverse managers that have to call themselves emerging managers and CalPERS? who's really looking at a 7% return, but has to use a variety of tools and managers to get there. If Henry Jones could change one thing, what would you change?
Oh man, one thing in terms of the universe.
You know I'm getting to the end when I say just change one thing, Henry. What would you change? You want two? I'll give you two.
And this is related to the diverse managers.
The whole thing. Diverse managers, emerging managers, using them. Everybody wants you to do more. You can't do more sometimes. What would you change? Just Henry Jones' perspective. No right or wrong. Just what would you change?
Oh man, it's it's gonna always go back to how did I get that 7%, and so how do I earn that 7%? I would oh man, that's a hard one. I think that first of all, I think some policy changes are necessary if we're going to accomplish that type of goal where you get, and it's hard to say one thing, Bob, because, right now we're dealing with the pandemic, but we know on the horizon there's this climate change that's going to have a very significant impact on our investment return. So you got all of these issues that you just can't lump it into one box. You're going to have to be a kind of like a generalist. The whole ESG issues, and you got the China-U.S. relationships. We're investors all over the world, and when that bubbles up to conflicts there, it affects our return. So I don't think I could have one thing. I would sit down and give you a list of 10 one day that I think that needs to be embarked upon to deal with all of these myriad of issues, because it's too global, because we invest in 10,000 different companies all over the world.
Yeah.
So you can't come up with one thing that's going to make any section of those companies better. You got to deal with a variety of areas. So sorry, maybe not answered your question, but
I appreciate the answer, Henry. And look, you and I were chatting in the green room before this started. The pandemic is a singular category of risk and opportunity at the same time for CalPERS, right? You're invested in drug manufacturers that may fix it one day. You're invested in other companies that are having to deal with long-term health care, right?
Exactly.
And then on the other side, you've got the issue of what are people going to do with commercial office space?
Exactly.
CalPERS has the biggest portfolio in the world of commercial office space. And at the time when people are scratching their heads saying, Henry can work just fine in his office at home, and Bob can work just fine in his place in Washington, D.C. So, no, I respect the answer. It was a great answer. Look, anything you want to ask me, Henry?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Barb, so how many are active members in the NAIC?
Yeah, so NAIC is a little bit different from the other groups. We have the individual firms are members, and we've been growing like crazy. In the last 7 years, we've gone from 31 members to today we have 90 members. Okay. And my task to my team is to see if we can get to 100 members by the end of the year. But we're growing very fast. We now have 7 fund of funds that are members. The members have gone from less than 100 billion in assets 7 years ago to over 170 billion in assets today. NAIC went from having just private equity to today we have all forms of private equity, as well as added hedge funds, and a number of general asset managers like Ariel Capital, more focused on mutual funds and long only, have joined because they realize the value of it. So it's been a really good run for NAIC over the last 7 years.
Well, good. So are any of the members also members of the other trade associations like NASP and AIM and American Alliance? So there's a cross-pollination.
I would say that across the organization, about 15% of the population is overlap between the groups. There's a fair amount of overlap between NAIC and New America Alliance. And then there's a fair amount of overlap between NAIC and AIM. And there's always been a fair amount of overlap individually between NAIC and NASP. And then there's a fair amount of overlap between the NAIC members and PE Win. So, there's a good amount of overlap. I find that that's very helpful because the organizations need to work together and collaborate together, because at the end of the day, we all do have a similar mission, which is an underserved population of highly talented people, and advocate for them to make sure that they get access and that they are able to demonstrate their ability to serve. So,
exactly. Right. Yeah, and that's important because I mean, this whole, these are diverse firms, and we, by the way, just established a chief diversity officer last week, and we are, and that's going to, across all areas of the institution, whether it's investments, whether it's healthcare, whether it's clients, member services, et cetera, for that whole area.
And you all are unique. That person is reporting directly into the office of the CEO, correct?
Exactly. And it needs to be, even though in any organization, you want to be sure that the whole in the organization is has bought in to the tenets of diversity and inclusion, but someone has to own it, and the CEO owns it, so it's appropriate for that person to report into the CEO. And matter of fact, the board is also engaged in trying to be sure that we are conscious of these issues. Also, last week we had our board offsite meeting, and by the way, we used to have 2 of those, but on our new governance policy, we only have 1, which is in July. And the board had a 2-hour session on diversity and inclusion, and to understand our implicit and explicit biases that we all carry. And so we had a nice long discussion. We had a leader that led us through that discussion to talk about some of these biases that exist throughout the organization, so that the board could also be mindful as it makes its decisions, that it's aware of these. And, emerging managers, it's an area. So, you talk to one person and you get a behavior response, and it means something different to somebody else than it does to me. Because I've been watching behaviors all my life, and I see something in somebody else that's not a Black person. They say, well, what is he mad about? Because I know what it means to me, So we need to understand each other going forward.
So Henry, we're coming up on our time, but I wanted to ask you a question, and it's a question that I think you touched on earlier. You were in Los Angeles during the time, I believe, of the Watts riot in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. You were in LA during the Rodney King era and the challenges that were faced there. And now you're seeing riots and protests. I'll call them protests again in the street. Given where we've been, do you think we're headed to a better place? Do you think that, are you hopeful that things are getting better? What's your perspective, having 40 plus years of observing how the city has grown, how people engage, and where we are from a social standpoint?
That's an excellent question, Bob. And historically, after events occurred, and by the way, I lived in Los Angeles, but I happened to be in Galveston, Texas during the wide riots. And so I was watching on TV, and the image that the whole LA was burning, and so that's the kind of image that went out. But in any event, after those occurrences in the past, there was protests, and there were decisions made to change policies, and there was going to be these outreach programs and things going to change. And then maybe not even a few years, a year or 2 later, the noise went down and it disappeared after each of those significant events that have occurred. This time, I truly believe it's different.
Okay.
And the reason I believe it's different, if you look at the profile of the people that are protesting, it's white people, it's Black people, it's Latino, Pacific Islanders, indigenous people, LGBTQ. It seems like this one has caught hold to the whole public space of people having concerns. And I think part of it is driven by the access to videos that now, because of the iPhones, etc., that people can see with their own eyes rather than having to be told that this is what happened to me and no one believed you.
Yeah.
But now you don't have to believe me, you believe your own eyes, except there are some people say don't believe what you see, but I'm not going to go there. But I think that's why I believe this time is different. And it's not just in the United States, Bob. Look at the whole world. There were demonstrations in all countries all over the world. So when you really want change, it requires this kind of involvement to make change. And that's why I believe this time we will be hopeful in seeing some systemic changes, because of it's the community as a whole versus this one group.
Yeah, that's a wonderful perspective. I appreciate you pointing that out. I mean, when you look at the multicultural nature of the protests, when you look at how serious people are, the refrain before was "We shall overcome," and now folks are really pushing Black Lives Matter. Not that Black lives are better than anyone else, but you can't say all lives matter if Black people are, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think we are all learning a lot. But Henry, you've been very generous with your time today. I want to thank you so much for making yourself available. I want to thank you for being an outstanding guest, our first guest. And I want to thank, I'm tough on CalPERS, not because of any other reason than I do believe that CalPERS is one of the finest organizations in the world. I believe that the mission that you all have is so extraordinary and so important to the lives of people around this country that we do owe a debt of gratitude. So please tell my friends at CalPERS, don't take my bark to be too much. It is a bark and not a bite. NAIC looks forward to many years of working together with you all. We know what your issues are, and you know what our interests are. And we'll continue to work at it and do the best that we can amongst different challenges and difficult circumstances. But I never underestimate and want to let it be known that we don't appreciate your friendship and we don't appreciate who you all are as outstanding people and leaders in society. So thank you for joining us today, Henry. Really take care.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, for the opportunity. Enjoyed our conversation. Okay.
Well, take care now.
Bye-bye.